Hello there fellow gamers and welcome back to Nelly's Nerd Cave, where we dive deep into the world of gaming and tech. Today we're putting the spotlight on a game that used to be quite difficult to run and cause a lot of headaches, Cyberpunk 2077. With its story-based gameplay, this particular game gave people headaches with the specs to be able to run this game at the time. So I'd like to see what the lowest spec is that I can actually run this particular game on. Now, according to CD Projekt Red's website, to make Cyberpunk 2077 work using Update 2 at 1080p low settings, I need at least Windows 10 or higher as an operating system, and the processor they suggest is an i7-7700 or a Ryzen 5 1600. As far as graphics cards are concerned, its minimum is a GTX 1060 6GB or an RX 580 8GB. So a minimum of 6GB of VRAM, it needs 12GB of DDR RAM and at least 70GB of SSD. Now if we look further on their website, we can see that there's a version 1.63 and it mentions that the lowest for that one is an i5 3570 and a GTX 970 as the lowest graphics card. So we're going to go all the way down to that particular processor as well and have a look and then see how far down we can go before we can't actually run the game. So I'm going to test these games on all these setups and I'm going to show you the benchmark results for those. And then I'm going to test what the game can run on its lowest particular spec that I have, which at this present moment in time is an i7-860. which is a first generation iCore processor. So first, let's have a rundown of the graphics cards that were mentioned within the specifications on CD Projekt Red. First up, we have the GTX 970. This is the one from MSI. This is the gaming 4G, so it's 4GB of RAM. This is a high-performance graphics card that combines NVIDIA's Maxwell architecture with MSI's advanced cooling and design features. Love these fans, look cool. It was released in 2014 and it offers a compelling balance of power, efficiency, overclocking potential, which I'm not using, and quiet operation with its zero fan technology, making it a popular choice amongst gamers and PC enthusiasts. And for those of you that are interested, this particular card comes at 68th in the Steam hardware survey. So, next up, what we have is the GTX 1060 Gaming X6G. This one is by the Asus ROG and it's the Strix version. This is a mid-range powerhouse that delivers excellent 1080p and some solid 1440p depending on the game. Powered by the Pascal architecture, this was released in 2016. It became a real favourite amongst budget-conscious gamers thanks to its efficient design, its quiet operation and impressive performance for the price. And amazingly, for a graphics card that's 9 years old, it ranks 12th in the Steam hardware survey. So there must be something to this card for it to be that far up. We'll see later. And finally, we have the Sapphire Nitro Plus RX 580 8GB. This is the special edition and it's a performance focused graphics card which features AMD's Polaris lineup. Released in 2017, it's designed for some good, smooth and 1080p and it's capable of a few 1440p gaming titles. It has this wonderfully blue shroud and it's factory overclocked and it has enhanced cooling with these wonderful fans that actually have one screw that you can remove them and replace them. It's visually stunning and it's a favourite among gamers looking for a balance of affordability, aesthetics and solid performance. And it ranks 35th in the Steam hardware survey. So still quite popular. So to start with, I'm going to be keeping some of these components consistently the same so that my bench testing is roughly consistent for some areas. Firstly, Here we have a 2.5 inch SSD by Kioxia. This is the Xperia. This is 480 gigabytes. On here I'm going to have all the test benches, and I'm going to have the operating system as well, which is going to be fundamental for it to function. I'm also going to have a crucial 1 terabyte SSD, which is currently in my test bench, and that's just got the game information on. So again, using Steam, the game information is on a separate drive. Another thing that's going to be consistent is the cooler. So I'm going to be using the Thermalright Assassin King 120. It comes with one 120mm fan. The cooler has 5 heat pipes, and it is really quite nice to use. It's virtually silent, and it's a good all-rounder. Comes in about £20 for these things, and this is going to be on every single cooler because it fits every single Intel cooler that I have. Also, when I use the thermal paste, I'm going to use the same thermal paste, which is the MX4 from Arctic. Really good thermal paste. I always use this because I find it really useful and nice. The slight differences are going to be the platforms that I use, because not every processor can fit in the same platform because they're all different amounts of pins, etc. But what I am going to do is I'm going to be using the same speed for both DDR3 and DDR4. So I looked in my box of tricks and found that the highest speed DDR3 is on this. This is the HyperX Genesis, and this is the Overclockers UK version of it, which is why it's red and black. But its speed is 2133 megahertz. I have two 8GB sticks here, giving us a total of 16. You'll have noticed it said its maximum or its minimum spec was 12, so I think 16 is about average. So that's 2133. I then looked and I found that actually I had DDR4 at 2133 megahertz as well, and this is the Corsair Vengeance LPX. Yes, I know for DDR4 this isn't the speediest, but what I wanted to do is I wanted to keep the benchmarks as consistent as possible as far as what I could control. Some of those things are speeds. So with that, we have our RAM. What I'm going to do is I'm going to have a whole plethora of CPUs. You can see I've got quite a few here. I've got the i7 6700. Again, this is a really good all-rounder. This one is 4 cores, 8 threads, produced in 2015. I'm going to then knock it down to the i5 6500 because it doesn't mention that, just to see what difference it is. It's 4 cores, 4 threads. I'm then going to go down and we're going to use the i7 4790K. I'm not going to be overclocking this, but again, this is 4 cores, 8 threads, released in 2014, so quite old. And then we're going to go down to the version 1.68 specifications, which is an i5 3570. And I'm then going to look at this and see how this works. This is 4 cores and 4 threads. Then after that, just for a bit of fun, I thought I would go to the i7 2600. This runs at 4 cores, 8 threads. It's a 2011 processor and is 3.4 gigahertz. And then I've got the first generation i7 860 running with 4 cores and 8 threads, released in 2009. And this is the original chip I bought many, many years ago when I first upgraded my computer from a dual core Intel. So it's still running and it still works absolutely perfectly. It's absolutely fantastic. As for the benchmarks, what I'm going to use is I'm going to use the Cyberpunk 2077's built-in test bench, and I'm going to show these results, and I'm going to run the test bench on low, medium and high settings. I'm going to keep everything the same. It's all going to be 1080p, but running those on those three different settings just to see if it makes a difference to your FPS. Plus, I'm also going to run the 3D Mark tools as well, using both TimeSpy and Steel Nomad, just to see what frames per second we'd get, because I think it might be interesting. So with all my little bits and pieces already sorted, join me in a moment for all the results after I spent ages doing all the testing.
Eventually.
Okay, so with all the testing done, which took forever, it's taken me about a week to do all this testing, we've got some great results. So now you're going to see hopefully some fancy charts that I've managed to create. And starting first of all with the i7 6700, we'll notice that I am going to kind of key mainly into the low settings of this, but you'll see that the other frames per second are also there. So Cyberpunk 2077 in low settings, For the i7 6700, for the RX 580, we got 53 frames per second. This is fantastic. It means that the game is relatively playable. With a GTX 1060, I got 55 frames per second, and with a GTX 970, I got 35. You'll also notice that as we go up the settings from into medium and high, that all the frame rates drop, but not by much. And it's quite good to see that even at high settings with the GTX 1060, you could still potentially play this game. Now, moving into the i5 6500, you'll notice that we drop our frame rate significantly and everything starts bunching together a little bit more. So low, medium, high settings, the lowest one for the for all those is the GTX 970 with 28 frames per second, and the highest is actually the RX 580 on low settings at 37 frames per second. So really there's about 9 frames within the lowest to the highest, and it's, yes, we've gone to high settings, but high settings, even for the RX 580 is 30 frames per second. That's 7 frames, and that's just absolutely ridiculous that we've got 7 frames between the high and the low settings for the RX 580. Similarly with the GTX 1060, we've got 35 frames for low settings and 30 frames for high settings. So it seems the lower thread count seems to be affecting the actual frames per second. If we look at the time spy results, we'll see again that we've got weird spikes. The 1060 has 35, the RX 580 has 28, compared to the i7 6700, which was 22 for both of those particular cards respectively. Now, when I move down to the 4790, again, you'll see that the frame rates kind of jump a little bit. Remember, this particular processor has 4 cores and 8 threads. The i5 6500 has 4 cores and 4 threads. So technically the 4790K actually has more processing power overall. And we can see that with the results, because the low settings here, 51 frames per second with the GTX 1060 in low settings and the RX 580. But the GTX 970 is closely following behind at 44 frames per second. Again, it's still significantly slower, but you could potentially play the game. Now, when I played the game on low settings, it did work. It worked quite well. It was a little bit slow at times. It did stutter from time to time, and I think that's probably due to the age of everything. But it did work rather well. The minute I got into high settings, that's when things changed in the gameplay. Yes, it says 38 frames per second on the 1060 and the 580, but things didn't really go according to plan when I was playing the game. It stuttered a hell of a lot more, and it kind of tried to chug along, but it managed to keep going. It's not very good gameplay at high, but low, you can get away with it. We then moved into the 1.68 settings, which is the i5 3570, and you'll see again that we've got this very close bunching up of all the results there from the high to the low settings, with the highest being 31 frames per second with the GTX 1060 and the GTX 970. So you'll see that the GTX 970 has been constantly around the 30 mark for 30 frames per second on all of the tests on low, and now it's level pegging with the GTX 1060 at low settings, and the RX 580 at low settings. And again, this is probably due to the age of the processor and the fact that it's just, the game is version 2, so it's not made now, is this game for these particular settings, but it's still quite playable. If you want to play this game at low settings, you have to turn quite a lot of those settings down, turn quite a lot of the NPCs off so that there's not many people floating around that are doing what they want to do. The map looks relatively empty, so it's kind of swings and roundabouts. So it's pretty good. It's playable, it's okay, but it's not the best experience. Then when we moved down to the i7 2600, I had some massive issues with the RX 580. That wonderful blue card that's now behind me gave me so much problems that I just didn't know what to do with it. That's the only RX 580 I've got at this present moment in time. And the motherboard is the exact same motherboard that I used for the 3570. However, the 2600 didn't see the hardware. So for the RX 580, I couldn't get it to see anything. It didn't see it in the BIOS, didn't see it in Windows or anything like that. Now what I did do is I looked for an update for that BIOS and found that the BIOS was already updated to the latest version. It is an old motherboard, so it's probably at its maximum, but for some strange reason on the 2600 it didn't function. So I only have results for the 1060 and the 970, and you'll see that the 1060 with the 2600 actually came out at 40 frames per second. When we look at TimeSpy, that's 26, which is pretty good. And even at the high settings, it wasn't that much further behind. You know, it was 33 frames, 7 frames behind the actual low settings. With the GTX 970, I ended up with 37 on low settings, and again on high settings, it was 10 frames behind. This at high settings was really an issue when it came to gameplay. It wasn't that good. It didn't really enjoy it, and it just made it hard work. And I'm sorry, unfortunately, I couldn't get the 580 results because it just wouldn't work. And finally, I pushed it right down to the i7 860. Remember, this is a processor from 2009. It's very old. It's the very first version of their iCore series, and it still managed to do really well. The GTX 1060 got 50 frames per second on low settings, and when you play the game with that particular card in low settings, it was really fun. It ran smoothly, it was really good. It fluctuated at its lowest at around about 40, but still quite playable. Now the GTX 970 came out at 40. Fortunately the RX 580 worked. I don't know why it didn't work on the 2600, but it didn't. And it came out at 39. So overall, the GTX 1060 was the powerhouse with the 860. Really good. Again, you can play this game. Now, the final chart here is the Cyberpunk low settings at 1080p for every single processor that I utilised. And you can see that there is a big fluctuation with all the results, with one not even being there for the 580 on the 2600. But you can see that there's quite a big difference, and you can see the ones where you have 4 cores 8 threads or 4 cores 4 threads. So the 6500, the 3570, obviously have 4 cores 4 threads, and then you have 8 cores 8 threads for the others. And it made a big difference having 8 cores and 8 threads. So would you want to play this game on an i7 860 or an i7 2600? Not really. The gameplay is going to be atrocious, and it was for some settings. Even running a 3570, they're all old processors now, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to run these games. I did have a few issues. I had a few problems with settings that wouldn't quite take when I was playing the game. When you run the benchmark, it does it for you, and it automatically figures stuff out. But then playing the game afterwards, I had to fiddle with it to make it work quite well. Now, the minimum spec I would suggest for this particular one would not be any of those three, but I would suggest the 4790K. And if you can get away with it, the GTX 1060 with 6 gigs of RAM. Not the 3 gig version, the 6 gig version. It's a really good card. You got 51 frames per second when you were running it at low settings. And you also got, with this particular one, again, looking back at the chart, you got 45 frames per second, 45 frames per second in medium settings. I would play it in low 1080p with this particular one. It's still quite enjoyable. I found it fun. At 1080p, you can't really tell that much. I was using a 27-inch monitor. The minute I put it on my 32, it did make a difference. My 32-inch monitor is 1440p, but it did make a difference when it rescaled it to a 1080. You could see a bit more pixelation, you could see a bit more squaredness of those characters within that. But overall, on a smaller monitor, it looked pretty damn good. And I would suggest, if you could, get the 4790K, get a decent enough motherboard for it, and overclock it slightly so that then you get an even better experience, because those frame rates will increase with the more clock speed that you have. Also, the GTX 1060 is overclockable, so see if you could potentially overclock that slightly as well, therefore increasing your FPS and getting a much, much better experience. Now, with all my testing done and everything finished, I can finally clean up and tidy the whole office up. And if you've really enjoyed this video and you've learned something, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Please click the buttons down below, and until next time, I will see you later in the Nerd Cave.